the tax collectors and sinners were approaching to listen to him, and the Pharisees and scribes are complaining, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." And Jesus said, "A man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the estate I have coming to me.' So he distributed the assets to them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered together all he had and travelled to a distant country, where he squandered his estate in foolish living. After he had spent everything, a severe famine struck that country, and he had nothing. Then he went to work for one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. He longed to eat his fill from the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one would give him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food, and here I am dying of hunger? I'll get up, go to my father, and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired workers.' So he got up and went to his father. But while the son was still a long way off, his father saw him, and he was filled with compassion. He ran, threw his arms round his neck and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father told his servants, 'Quick! Bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Then bring the fattened calf and slaughter it, and let's celebrate with a feast. Because this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Now his older son was in the field. As he came near to the house, he heard music and dancing. So he summoned one of the servants, questioning what these things meant. 'Your brother is here,' he told him, 'and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf because he is back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and didn't want to go in. So his father came out and pleaded with him. But he replied to his father, 'Look, I've been slaving many years for you, and I've never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me a goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your assets with prostitutes, you slaughtered the fattened calf for him.' 'Son,' he said to him, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'"
On Sunday mornings, we've been looking at a bit of a series on Jesus and then we've thought of various things that are a result of living in a fallen world that Jesus deals with on our behalf. So we started off by looking at Jesus and our guilt a few weeks ago now. We looked at that from Genesis chapters 2 and 3. But we're also looking at now Jesus and our shame. I spent 1 week on Jesus and our guilt because that's a thing we do think of often. It kind of comes to us naturally to see the gospel in those terms, and the gospel is not less than Jesus and our guilt, is it? It's definitely not. It's important, vitally important, indispensable to the gospel that Jesus deals with our guilt. But we're spending a bit more time thinking about Jesus and our shame, because that's a thing perhaps we do not think about so often, and yet it is surprisingly prevalent in the Bible. And very much the gospel, Jesus addresses our shame as fallen human beings. So again, we looked at shame in Genesis chapters 2 and 3. That's maybe 3 weeks ago now. It's integral to the Bible's story we discovered there in Genesis 2 and 3. Once Adam and Eve are made, at the end of Genesis 2, we have that description of them. They were naked in each other's presence, and they felt no shame. which is an unusual thing to say unless shame is going to be a very important theme in the rest of the Bible story. And of course the fall happens and sin enters the world. There is guilt. They have broken God's command. They are objectively guilty. But in many ways the passage also focuses on their shame. Suddenly they realise they are naked in front of one another, and they feel exposed to one another and judged by one another, and they want to hide from one another. They cover themselves in fig leaves. They want to hide from God as well. They run. They hide amongst the trees as God comes down, I think it's in the person of the Son, walks in the garden and calls out to them, "Where are you?" We're afraid, so we hid. Shame is very prevalent. We saw in Genesis 2 and 3, though, that God is compassionate. Those fig leaves couldn't cover them, but he gives them a better covering that will point to the ultimate covering. An animal is killed and they're clothed in animal skins by God himself, their shame covered, pointing to Jesus' righteousness one day covering us. And then last time we were in John chapter 4, Jesus and the Samaritan woman, and we saw there a woman who lived in shame. A woman who isolated herself from others, was cut off from others, shunned by others. And what we particularly saw as we looked at that incident in John 4 and Jesus meeting her at the well is that we can't escape shame by looking across to others around us. Not fully. And we can't escape shame by looking inward to ourselves. But looking to Jesus, there is a way out of shame. He will not isolate us when we look to him. He sat with that woman, loved her, gave her the water of life, sent her out to tell others. The very people she had hid from, she now went and told the gospel. And he had delivered her from her sin and her shame. This morning, we're going to particularly think about what it means for Jesus, in the words of Hebrews 12:2, to despise the shame. I read these verses right at the start of the service this morning. Hebrews chapter 12, if you're one of those who likes to look up references as we go, and don't worry if you're not, you can just listen. But if you want to look it up, it's Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2. Verse 1 of Hebrews 12 has that idea of since we have such a large crowd of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every hindrance and the sin that so easily ensnares us. Let us run with endurance the race that lies before us. This is living the Christian life through faith, because the previous passage was all about faith in Hebrews 11 in Jesus. Let's run with endurance the race that lies before us, but to do that we must keep our eyes on Jesus, the source and perfecter of our faith. And then it says of him, of Jesus, for the joy that lay before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. It's a strange phrase, isn't it? Despising the shame. I wonder if you've ever stopped and thought about what the author of the Hebrews means there by despising the shame. But we're going to try and think about it a bit more this morning. What it means for Jesus to despise the shame, and why it's very good news for us that he does. So we'll do that by looking at two stories from the Gospels, one from Mark, which we haven't read yet, and one from Luke, which Kathy read earlier. And then we'll go finally to the cross as well, and see there how Jesus despises the shame. So first of all, again, if you have a Bible, you may wish to turn there. Don't worry, you may just wish to listen. But if you have a Bible and want to turn to it, turn to Mark and chapter 5. Mark chapter 5. I'm going to particularly look at verses 21 through to verse 34. 21 to 34. Just before we look at this first story, let me pick up on something that's come up as we've looked at shame, but that's important to stress before we look at these two stories. I've chosen the two stories we'll look at. The story of the woman, particularly in Mark 5, who comes up in the middle of this story about Jairus and his daughter. There's a woman in the middle of it. We're going to think about her, and then we'll think about the prodigal son. I've chosen these two stories specifically because shame is a major theme in both. A home group on Wednesday night, we were thinking about shame and what we've looked at already, and the fact there are two different sorts of shame. They're both shame, but there's two different sorts. They can have a different source, in other words, of shame when you feel it. To put it in very broad categories, and they are broad, a person may feel shame because of something genuinely wrong that they have done. You've probably experienced that at some point. You've done something wrong, the Bible would say you have sinned, and you feel shame because of that objective guilt. And it is objective guilt, the feeling associated with that objective guilt, if you feel it, is shame. So the source is your wrongdoing. Adam and Eve in the garden. But we've also seen that people can suffer shame not because of a sin that they committed, but because of some other reason. It could be false guilt, couldn't it? You may have suffered this yourself. It's often easier to see, though, in others. They feel guilty about something, but you know that that something was not anything that they've done wrong. They just think they've done wrong. Sometimes this happens with people who've been abused. They think it must be in some way my fault. That person treated me and rejected me in the way they did, and they feel shame. As if it were their fault. That's false shame. Well, it's real shame, it's false guilt, sorry. It may be just the rejection of family, a peer group, society in general, for some characteristic a person has that they have no control over. And they're excluded. And they feel shame that they have done nothing wrong. And you may be able to think of many more examples as well. There are many more. But shame has that source as well, doesn't it? What I want to see in these stories is that Jesus despises both of those forms of shame. The ones that come from guilt, genuine guilt, and the ones that do not come from guilt, but from other sources. He despises the shame. So hopefully you've got to it now, Mark chapter 5. Let's have a look at this story here. I'll read the verses through, we'll see the story develop, and make some comments as we go. So verse 21 of Mark chapter 5. When Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the sea. One of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came. So Jairus would have been a leading figure in his community. He's a leader of the synagogue. He's someone that people looked up to. He's probably not a man who carried a great deal of shame. He's a public figure who seems happy to be in a public position with people looking at him. There may have been causes of shame in his life, but they're not evident here. When he saw Jesus, middle of verse 22, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly. My little daughter is dying. Come and lay your hands on her so that she can get well and live. So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd was following and pressing against him. Jairus, just to notice, feels no shame about coming to Jesus. He comes directly to him, he faces him, he falls down before him, yes, because he has seemingly a reverence for it, and he's desperate. His daughter is dying. But he looks at Jesus, doesn't he? And says, help me, save my daughter. He has a real, very urgent problem home. But shame isn't present at that point with him. There's a contrast, though, with the next person in the story, isn't there? Now look at verse 25 and following. Jesus has begun to go to Jairus' home. It's urgent. A girl is at death's door. He cares. But then this, in verses 25 to 32. Now a woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years had endured much under many doctors. Let me just stop there. A woman bleeding for 12 years would have been considered unclean in that society. We don't so much in Western British society have categories of clean and unclean, really, do we? At least not phrased like that. Not as stark as it would have been here. But it was very much the case there. It's very much the case in some other cultures today. For 12 years this had been going on. That's a long time to be avoided by other people. Because of something that is in the category of not being her fault. We said once or twice maybe in discussion with people, I said, because others have pointed it out to me, that because we're from a society that doesn't talk about shame very much and perhaps doesn't see it or think about it very much, we don't always have eyes to spot when it's right there on the page in the Bible. Someone from a culture like Jesus' culture 2,000 years ago would have read this and immediately realised, oh, shame. The contrast with Jairus, public figure, important person. People looked up to him, he didn't hide. He came to Jesus' feet, looked him straight in the eye as it were, and pleaded for help. But this woman is suffering from shame. She'd endured much under many doctors. She had spent everything she had and was not helped at all. She was therefore penniless. What would a penniless person have had to do in order to get by? Beg. She had no money anymore. It was all gone. I think we can perhaps relate to that when you see a beggar on the street, someone homeless, pleading for money. They often struggle to look you in the eye, don't they? There's a shame associated with that. She has nothing. She's penniless. More shame. So she spent all this money, not helped at all. On the contrary, end of verse 26, she became worse. Having heard about Jesus' fame has spread through the region. She knows about him. She knows that he's a miracle worker. She came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothing. She does not want to be seen. As we've thought about shame over the last couple of weeks, one of the constants we've seen with when someone is suffering from shame is that they want to hide. Now, they may hide by literally trying to get out of everyone's sight. They may hide by putting up a front that isn't really them and covers up what's going on inside. She just doesn't want to be seen, this woman, does she? She knows that she's living in shame because of this issue she has with bleeding, because she's penniless, she's likely a beggar. She does not want to be seen. She's isolated, isn't she? Do you imagine she had many friends? Do you imagine she had many people who would spend time with her? She wouldn't have many people like that at all, if any. So, she came up behind him in the crowd, verse 27, and touched his clothing. For she said, and this not out loud, I wouldn't have thought, but in her own mind and heart, she said, if I just touch his clothes, I don't want to be seen, I don't want him to look at me, But it is powerful, I've heard. If I just touch his clothes, I'll be made well. And then I can just disappear off without being seen, and nobody will be any the wiser about what has happened. So that's what she does. Instantly, verse 29, her flow of blood ceased, and she sensed in her body that she was healed of her affliction. I wonder what we would expect Jesus' reaction to that may be. Jesus knows everything, doesn't he? He knows what this woman has gone through physically, but he knows, no doubt as well, that it will have put her through a life of shame for at least the last 12 years. That's a long time. And we might think the compassionate thing is just to let her slip away quietly without being seen. I must admit, I'd be tempted to respond, not that this woman could touch my clothes and be healed of an issue of blood, but if I was in that position, I'll just let her slip away quietly. She doesn't want anyone to see her. Just let her go. And yet that isn't Jesus' reaction, is it? Not at all. Verse 30. At once Jesus realized in himself that power had gone out from him. So he just carried on going to Jairus' house and let the woman slip away. No. He turned around in the crowd and said, and I think we're supposed to understand in a loud voice so that the crowd could hear, "Who touched my clothes?" Is he being insensitive? He's not. He's not being insensitive at all. He wants to know who touched him. He's felt the power go out of him. The woman has trusted Jesus to deal with her physical problem. She's bleeding. Jesus could have left it at that, but he wants to help the woman in another way too. He knows there's something else that needs to be confronted and healed. Remember, this woman is unclean because of her bleeding. But also, if you touch an unclean person in that culture, you are now unclean as well. You avoid touch with unclean people. Because the uncleanness is contagious, if you like. And shame is contagious too. You bring shame on yourself when you allow yourself to be touched by, when you touch someone who is unclean. But Jesus, I can't quite say he isn't bothered about that. He is bothered about her shame. But he's not bothered that he's going to be drawn into it too. Because he cares for her. Look at that phrase in verse 32. We can go on. We read verse 31. His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing against you, yet you say you touched me. Lots of people are touching you." "Yes, but I want one specific one," says Jesus, "that touched me." Verse 32. But he was looking around to see who had done this. Jesus isn't going to let this go. I think that should take us back to the Garden of Eden, shouldn't it? Remember God coming down in the cool of the evening in the Garden of Eden? I think that is God the Son coming down there, but whether it is or it isn't, it is God like to do this. And Jesus is God. Coming down and trying to find people hiding in shame, Adam and Eve, calling out to them, "Where are you? Come to me." Here he is doing it with this woman. Although this is a woman who hasn't sinned, at least she's not suffering shame because of her own sin, she's suffering shame because of other factors. But Jesus is saying, "Where are you? Come out of hiding. Where are you?" Verse 33. The woman, with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. That's remarkable, isn't it? Jesus drew her in such a way that she realised, I can tell him everything. And he is not going to shun me like everybody else. Or maybe she wasn't quite sure yet whether that would be the case. But she was willing to find out. It's a scary thing to do, but she does it. With fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, she knew she'd been healed of her bleeding, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Isn't that an encouragement? If you're feeling some resonance with this woman this morning, you think, yeah, that's me to some extent. Perhaps not for the same reason, but you feel shame because of something done to you that has happened to you that is not your fault, but it's happened. You can come to Jesus. You can tell him. He wants you to. In fact, he says, where are you? Come to me. And you can tell him. Look at his response. Verse 34. Daughter. What an interesting phrase to use. Maybe she's been watching what's going on with Jairus and how much Jairus loves his daughter, this hugely important man reduced to his knees before Jesus saying, my daughter is dying, I love her, come and help her. And Jesus saying, yes, I will. She's seen that, she's there as it's all been happening. Jesus turns to her and calls her daughter. Isn't that a wonderful choice of word in the circumstances? You see how much Jairus' daughter matters to him? You matter to me. You're my daughter. Daughter, he said to her, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction. There's both the affliction dealt with, the bleeding, but he's also saying, I am accepting you as my daughter. You have peace with me. What does shame do? It cuts us off from one another. It cuts us off from God as we run and as we hide. What does Jesus do for this woman? Calls her daughter, welcomes her in. Jesus and our shame. And in doing that, he was willing to put himself in what appeared to be a shameful situation, welcoming someone who was unclean and living in shame and saying, come, you can touch me. I love you. You are mine. I'm with you. And I don't care what anybody else thinks. I'm with you. Wonderful. Come to him. But let's go on. That's the first story. It's a way of saying that Jesus despises the shame. We think of despise in a kind of negative way, but it's a wonderful thing that Jesus does not allow shame to come between you and him. In that sense, he despises the shame. That's what the writer to the Hebrews means. He despises the shame. Let's look next at the story we heard earlier. It's very familiar, isn't it? Time's going, so I may have to speed up a little bit. Let's go to Luke and chapter 15. Luke chapter 15, you'll probably know the story well. If you don't, that's fine. Hear it as we go through it again now from Luke and chapter 15, the story of what is sometimes called the prodigal son. Perhaps I'm going to suggest, that it's also helpful to see it as the prodigal family. The prodigal family. Sometimes this is taken to be a story, the story of the prodigal, about honour being restored, and that's the lens through which we see it. You know, he's gone away and he's sinned and neglected and thrown away his inheritance, and yet honour is restored at the end with a party thrown for him, this son. But I'd like to suggest, and it's not me that first suggested this, but I think it's true, that this isn't really a story about honour being restored as such, but about relationship being restored at the cost of honour. I'll say that again. It isn't so much a story about honour being restored, but about relationship being restored at the cost of honour. As you work through it, it's a story about a father who is so desperate to be reconciled to his wayward child that he gives up all the usual rules of honour, status and privilege and pretty much shames himself. He joins the child in the place of shame, so that even if they're despised together by others, they are together. Let's look at the parable. I asked Kathy to do the reading, and I asked her to read not just verses 11 through to the end of the chapter, but verses 1 and 2 of chapter 15 as well. I think that's important because it helps to explain the way I'm going to read the parable, if you like. So right at the start of chapter 15, all the tax collectors and sinners were approaching to listen to Jesus. These are people who everybody else looked down on as shameful. Okay? Sinners and tax collectors. And the Pharisees and scribes were complaining, the religious elite. This man, Jesus, welcomes sinners and eats with them. Jesus' response to that accusation, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them, is to tell three parables, the last of which is the one we're going to look at now, the prodigal. But notice that in the parable of the prodigal, there is a man who welcomes sinners and eats with them, isn't there? And he's called the Father in the prodigal. And we often read it in such a way as, that's God the Father. But I think it's perfectly legitimate here to say, well, Jesus is presenting himself here as a father. He does that. I mean, he did that with the woman we just read about in Mark 5, didn't he? Daughter. I think here, actually, it may well be the case, and I think it's the case, you can disagree if you wish, it doesn't really change the meaning that much, because it's still God. But I think the Father is Jesus here. I think he's talking about himself. Because the Pharisees and scribes were complaining, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. Jesus says, well, let me tell you a story about someone who eats with sinners and welcomes them. Then we get to the prodigal. So, let's go. Let me find my place in my notes, sorry. Starts in verse 12. A man had two sons. We're about to see the first piece of shameful behaviour. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate I have coming to me. Again, we don't often look at things through the lens of shame because of our culture, but people listening to this would have immediately thought, what a shameful thing for him to do, to treat his father that way. Basically wishing him dead. He's bringing shame upon himself. Apparently, this younger son, though, doesn't feel that shame. He's shameless. But others look at him as doing something shameful. But what about the father? I think in this parable is Jesus. He does something that would be interpreted, at least in a society like the one he was in, as a shameful thing to do. He gives him the money. What should he have done, according to societal standards? Cut him off from the family. How dare you ask that? What a shameful thing to do. You're bringing shame on me by wishing me dead and taking my money. No. But he doesn't do that. He doesn't cut him off. He gives him the money. How do you think people around would have thought of him for doing that? And yet he does. The older son is caught up in this shame too. It's interesting, isn't it? So the father, middle of verse 12, he distributed the assets to them. In all honesty, the older son at this point should have been saying, wait a minute, no father, you shouldn't be doing this, and no, I'm not accepting this. I'll wait. That would have been the honourable thing to do. No, he takes the money too. We move on in the story. More shameful behaviour follows in verse 13. Not many days later, the younger son gathered together all he had, travelled to a distant country where he squandered his estate in foolish living. It's kind of veiled over what he does there. The older son doesn't veil it over later. He spent it on prostitutes. Shameful behaviour. But again, he doesn't seem to feel any shame. At this point, he's chosen to do it, but feels no shame. But then he ends up in a position where he begins to feel intense shame, verses 14 to 16. After he had spent everything, a severe famine struck that country and he had nothing. Here's the penniless thing again. Beggar. Shame. Then he went to work for one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. More shame. Unclean animal. A pig. Shame. Having to work with pigs. He didn't do that as a good Jewish boy. Verse 16, it gets so bad he longed to eat his fill from the pods the pigs were eating, but no one would give him anything. Isolated, cut off, despised, ignored, shame. Again, we perhaps read it and don't immediately think those categories, but in that culture you do straight away. Shame. God uses the shame, you could say, in this story. Verse 17, he comes to his senses. Perhaps he begins to feel the shame not just of no money, feeding pigs, being abandoned by everyone. He begins to feel the shame of what he'd done to his father. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food, and here I am dying of hunger. I'll get up, go to my father, and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired workers.'" He knows not only the shame he's brought on himself, but he's beginning to recognise the shame he's brought on his father. So he actually devises a plan, doesn't he, to try and work around that shame for his father. Rather than putting his father, he thinks, through something he surely won't want to do, which is accept me back on as a son, because that would bring more shame on the father to do that. I will instead offer this. I will just work as a hired servant, helping my father to dodge the shame and therefore me to at least have a roof over my head and food on my plate. Now look at the father in verse 20. And again, I think it's Jesus. He's the image of his father, so it would be God the Father too. Verse 20. So he, the son, got up and went to his father. But while the son was still a long way off, his father saw him, and it doesn't say, and was filled with shame, which is the expectation of what a father would feel seeing a son like this. Sometimes we feel a little ashamed of the actions of those closest to us, don't we? But what does this father feel? Compassion. Compassion. He then does something, and again, you've probably heard this before, or you might well have if you've come across books or sermons on this passage before. He does something that was shameful to do in that culture. In that culture, old men don't run. Okay? They just do not. It's not an honourable thing to do. You gracefully as you can walk. You definitely don't run. Middle of verse 20, he ran. He doesn't care what anybody else thinks. You see the despising, the shame going on again here? Who cares about the shame here? I need to go to him. He ran, threw his arms around his neck and kissed him. At this point the son starts his speech, doesn't he? "Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." We know the next beat of the speech. Treat me as one of your hired servants. I'll just be a hired servant. Doesn't even get that far. Because the father told his servants, "Quick, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Then bring the fattened calf and slaughter it. Let's celebrate with a feast, because this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he was found." So they began to celebrate. This man welcomes sinners and eats with them. This man welcomes the shamed and enters into the shame with them for the sake of restoring the relationship. The Father, Jesus here, doesn't care that his actions look shameful to those around. because he gets to be with his child. Isn't that wonderful? Now, this is helpful if you are someone who feels guilty for something you genuinely have done wrong, and you wonder whether God would actually want you back, whether Jesus would want you. And perhaps you're a Christian who has fallen into that sin again that you thought you killed and got rid of, but you've done it again. Or you've done something else that you know to be incredibly wrong, and you're thinking, well, I could go, but I'm going to have to go in such a way as to say, well, not expect him to throw his arms around me. But he does. You may think, my actions have brought shame on the name of Jesus, and maybe they have, but he will still welcome you with open arms when you come. Isn't that good? It's true. I've already gone on longer than I intended. One last thing. What is the most incredible example of Jesus despising the shame? It's the cross, isn't it? It's the cross. The cross is the ultimate example of Jesus running towards the sinful and the shame, and entering into what looks incredibly shameful to the outside world, to be with his people who he loves. Think of what happens to Jesus at his death. At his arrest, he is deserted by those closest to him. One of them tries to follow at a distance, Peter. But his shame is too great, actually, to admit that he's a friend of Jesus. And in doing that, of course, he shames Jesus. The Roman soldiers mock Jesus, pouring shame upon him. As Jesus tries to carry his cross, it turns out he's too weak to carry it, and someone else has to carry it, bringing more shame upon him. He can't even physically carry his own cross. On the cross, he is naked and exposed. Shame. And the Romans wouldn't allow their own citizens to be executed via crucifixion, because it was the most shameful way of executing someone. Not just the most painful, the most shameful. He's crucified. As he is dying the shameful death of the cross, he is mocked again. If you are the Messiah, save yourself. Shame poured upon him. He even cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Shamed people feel forsaken by others, don't they? What a shameful death that he runs towards because he loves his people. He enters into their shame with them. He carries their sin, and he enters their shame, and he despises the shame, and he dies for them. Isn't that amazing? That's what the writer to the Hebrews is getting at when it says he despised the shame. Why did he despise the shame? For the joy that was set before him. What's that joy? It's the feast, isn't it? He's going to rise again, and he's going to sit down and he's going to eat with all those sinful, shamed people that he died for. That's the joy for him. Jesus is looking forward to that day when you sit down with him in glory. Isn't that amazing? His sons and daughters, if you want to put it that way. His brothers and sisters, as it's also sometimes put. His people that he loves. His treasured possession. What a wonderful Saviour. Should we pray? Lord Jesus, thank you that you are one who welcomes sinners and eats with them. You are one who welcomes the shamed and despises the shamed in order to be with them. Thank you for showing that most wonderfully at the cross, where you took our sin upon yourself and suffered the penalty of sin. But thank you as well that you also suffered the shame. But you despised the shame, knowing that by running towards the people shamed by our sin and by just being in a fallen world, there will be joy to come. A people drawn to yourself. For all of us who have been drawn to yourself, we thank you and praise you and worship you this morning. And we look forward to that day as well, when we will be face to face with you. Thank you, Lord Jesus. Amen.